Well, I'll get started. What my approach today on the inspection contingency really comes from Steph and my point of view. These are usually the myths around what is allowed and not allowed in the inspection contingency, because we get calls from either our agents at Keller Williams or co-broke agents from another company, or complaints from our agents about another co-broke on misguided or not known myths about the inspection contingency. It's amazing how this still keeps coming. Questions keep coming about whether they have to turn in the report or not, or whether they allow somebody in or not. These questions keep popping up. And so this approach today is really taking about 7 myths that either co-brokes or our agents think is true about the inspection contingency, and they're not. They're myths. So we're going to go over it from that angle, the most common myths that we hear about the inspection contingency. So myth 1 is there is no definition of a test or inspection in the offer to purchase. That is not true. On lines 178, and I'm using lines for the new mandated offer to purchase August 15th, 24. On lines 178 to 192, it does say the inspection contingency specifically states that only authorizes inspections, not testing. In order for the buyer to be permitted to test, the contract must include a testing contingency. So always remember, or remind your co-broker if they're arguing this, that you must separate the testing part of the contract from the inspection part of the contract. You cannot loop them together as testing requirements of whatever the inspection said and things like that. If the inspector said something had to be checked and it included a test, and the buyer did not put in testing contingency in their offer, they cannot test. They cannot go that route. Remember, always separate the inspection part of the contract from the testing part of the contract. Remember, in the offer to purchase, the only testing referred to in that is the radon test. It's right under the inspection contingency. You can test it out of the offer to purchase for radon. Any other tests, such as mold, lead-based paint, all the other testing that occurs, has to come from a request in the Addendum A, the GMAR Addendum A, that includes testing in your contract. As I said, the only testing allowed in the offer to purchase is radon. So if you have questions about this, read carefully lines 178 to 192 and state that that is not true. There is a definition of test and inspection in the offer to purchase. Any questions? Okay, we'll go to the next. The home inspection contingency provides for 3 forms of inspection. So remember, we're talking just about home inspection contingency. An inspection conducted by a Wisconsin registered home inspector. You can't use Uncle Jake, who is a handyman, to come in and be your inspector. You can use him, but you can't use his report to define notice of defects. So it has to be a Wisconsin registered home inspector. Number 2, any enumerated component inspections. On the blank lines, in the first lines of the home inspection, there are 2 blank lines, and that is for you to enumerate specific areas of the house that you want tested, that you want inspected. say you're a little concerned about the roof from what you are observing. You're worried about the water stains in the basement. You can put on those blank lines things like roof, re roof condition, or you can put in foundation or water intrusion or things like that on those blank lines, which mean then you can automatically get another inspector in to inspect those areas that you have some concern. And number 3, follow-up inspections recommended by a written report from one of the previously authorized inspectors. So if any of the authorized inspectors noted something in their report, maybe about the chimney, maybe about the foundation, maybe about bracing, whatever, you can use those to get another inspector in to look specifically at those issues. So it says, note that the ability to conduct follow-up inspections, but not testing, is limited to those inspections recommended in writing by the authorized inspector. So it's got to be in his report. The blank lines at 197 and 198 should be used only to list the specific components of the property that will have specific inspections and should not refer to as testing. So keep that clear, keep those separated from testing and inspections, but those 2 blank lines are for components that you may worry about when writing the offer or something that came up in the inspector's report. Any questions about this myth? Okay, we'll go to the next one. Now, again, these are typical questions that Steph and I will get regarding the inspection contingency. And it's usually the co-broke isn't totally informed. And you're trying to convince the co-broke that that's not part of the contract. And then we get the calls, what do I do about this? So myth number 2, the seller does not have to give anyone access to the property. And that is definitely not true. And the lines are, to prove it, the truth, are lines 182 to 185. Seller agrees to allow buyers and appraisers reasonable access to the property upon advance notice, if necessary to satisfy a contingency. Buyer and licensee may be present at all inspections and testing. So there is the proof. If somebody says the seller's not letting those persons in, an appraiser, maybe the buyer is getting a non-contingent financing, but he still has to have access for his appraiser to get into the property. The seller must allow him to get into the property. If you legitimately ask for a follow-up inspection and the seller does not allow it, the seller may be at default because it does say right in the contract that the seller must allow access. So if the seller attempted to prevent a person who is authorized per the terms of the offer, such as an inspector, tester, or appraiser, access to the property, the buyer may be able to successfully argue the seller is not acting in good faith. In the offer, the seller agrees to allow any of the buyer's inspectors, testers, appraisers access to the property to satisfy the contingency agreed to in the offer to purchase. Very important, and we do get a lot of pushback sometimes from co-brokes who may not be as well trained as you are. But they do have it, and it's right there in writing. Myth number 3, and I think this is a very common one that we get some pushback or argument on. Sometimes the co-broke will say, well, we're not sending the inspector's report to you, the seller's agent, because actually there's nothing there. There's nothing, they're accepted, the house is good. So I don't need to send you a copy of the inspection report or testing report. That's a myth. That's not true. And the truth is, right in lines 189 to 192, the buyer agrees to promptly restore the property to its original condition after buyers, inspectors, and testing are completed, unless otherwise agreed to with the seller. Buyer agrees to promptly provide copies of the inspection and testing reports to the seller. The seller acknowledges that certain inspections or tests may detect environmental pollution, which then may be required to report to the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Sorry, that got cut off there. This obligation is separate and independent of giving notice of defects or attempting to negotiate an amendment for repairs. So it doesn't matter if there are no issues. The buyer just wants to buy the property, nothing he's objecting to in the inspection or testing. So they feel they don't have to send along the reports. They do, per the contract, per lines 189 and 192. The obligation is separate and independent of giving notice of defects or attempting to negotiate an amendment for repairs. So it says in the contract, promptly give the report to the seller's agent. Any questions regarding this? We do get questions on this. There's a co-broke that will just say, no, we don't need to send it to you. We say, yes, you do.
Then as an extension of that too, if as a listing agent, you have a inspection report that a buyer's agent had given you and the deal falls apart, you do not need permission to share that report. It does belong to the seller, and they are free to do with it as they wish. So if they want to provide it to buyer number 2, they are able to do that.
Yeah, and if they don't do that, they're obligated to amend their property condition report to reflect anything that was discovered in that report. They can either share the report or add to the issues in an amended real estate condition report. Okay, myth number 4, the right to cure provision should always say seller shall have the right to cure. I hear this a lot. I want to go back into ancient times. As an agent, when this right to cure provision was added to our contracts, and it was something that we really had to change our minds and understand and listen to because it was a brand new provision, the right to cure. The company I was with hired lawyers from Foley and Lardner who said that neither one is exclusive, that it should get down to the actual contract and circumstances of the contract and circumstances of the market on whether the buyer gives the seller right to cure or does not give the seller right to cure. When the seller has right to cure, the deal is not dead, and the seller can elect to either cure it, or if he elects not to cure it, then the deal is dead. But the final decision is in the seller's lap. If the seller does not have the right to cure, the final decision is in the buyer's lap. The buyer, if he sends the right notice of defect and the seller does not have the right to cure, the buyer can terminate that contract just by sending that notice of defect. It's something that depends on the market conditions that we've been in the past several years, very competitive. We want to give the seller as much incentive as possible to select your offer. So obviously, the seller will want to see that he has right to cure, that the buyer just can't automatically kill the deal by sending a notice of defect. So market conditions, I would say right to cure is a good thing to give to the seller. But there will be other markets where maybe buyer's market is in demand, and the buyers says, you don't have a right to cure. I can decide if there are no defects I don't want to live with in this property. I can terminate the contract on my own. So I've been through both situations several times. So we always chose what the circumstances were at that moment, whether or not the seller should have right to cure or not. I think it's been quite a few years where we have been giving the seller right to cure because of the competition in the seller's market. So the truth says there is no right or wrong way to draft the right to cure provision. Licensees should explain the provision and discuss the buyer's options. Don't say, and I've heard people say it, don't say, I always give seller right to cure, or I never give the seller right to cure. It's got to be looked at transaction by transaction.
And
And
it's a choice that your buyer is making after you explain it.
exactly. And sometimes it's hard to explain it. It's really not that clear of a options or choice that they have. So make sure they understand what they're choosing.
Okay.
So this is sort of an overview of the right to cure provision. The buyer, and this helps you educate your buyer when they're writing the offer. The right to cure provision is drafted to say seller shall have the right to cure. Now, if they do, the seller has three options. They can deliver to the buyer within 10 days a written notice that the seller will cure the defects, thus keeping the offer alive. The seller must cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner and deliver to the buyer a written notice detailing the work done within 3 days prior to closing. There is also an option if you're a smarty agent that you put in your offer to purchase initially, that if notice of defects are delivered, that the seller must not only cure it in a good and workmanlike manner, but also use a proper contractor and get lien waivers and get a copy of the receipt and things like that. So that's in a paragraph in our global library that you can pop into your offer when you're initially writing on this property. So if you're giving them right to cure in the offer, I would place that paragraph in there. Deliver to the buyer written notice that the seller will not cure the defects, and that makes the offer null and void. Or three, his other choice is do nothing. And this also makes the offer null and void. So if he doesn't send a notice back saying he will not cure, but if it goes beyond the 10 days and he hasn't sent anything, that means then the offer is still null and void. If the sellers shall not have the right to cure, the minute the notice of defects is delivered, the deal is null and void. Okay, any questions over right to cure?
I just want to comment here that so you guys can hopefully see, when the seller has the right to cure, that obviously is more advantageous for them versus not having the right to cure, where it's more advantageous for the buyer. And that's why, going back to Joan's prior slide, where it's really just market driven in terms of like what is more common in terms of how a contract is written, whether it's the buyer, whether or not it's in the ball is in the buyer's court or if the ball is in the seller's court. Um, so that there you
Yeah,
go.
and remember what the note, if, when the notice of defect is delivered to the seller and the seller has this choice to cure them or not cure them, he has to cure all of the defects listed on the notice of defects. He can't pick and choose. He can't offer a credit instead of curing. That's for an amendment back and forth. You can't negotiate on a notice. So the seller can only have the choice, I will cure it, and that means he'll cure all the defects listed, or he says, I will not cure it. He can't come back and say, I'll cure the chimney, and that's it. It's all or nothing. Okay, I don't think this is done as much as it used to be. It used to be done all the time. that the buyer's agent would send a notice and an amendment at the same time. Sort of like, here's your choice, seller. You can either deal with the notice of defects and how you want to deal with that, or you can first deal with the amendment and we'll see if we can get an amendment back and forth. The real estate rules say that a notice takes precedent over anything. So really, when you're sending a notice out, maybe with the amendment to choose, the notice goes into effect immediately. You can't send them both and let the seller have a choice. So the truth is, giving the notice and amendment simultaneously will cause a great deal of confusion. That's when we get a call. Therefore, the path of least confusion would be to provide the amendment attempting to negotiate the terms, followed by the notice if the seller does not agree to the amendment. So you put a due date on the amendment, say what your terms are, you're willing to compromise this way and that way, and put a deadline on it. And if the seller does not agree to that deadline or never responds, then you send the notice of defect and make sure that you're watching the clock, that you don't go beyond the expiration date of the inspection contingency. So you've got to quickly get that notice in if you can't get an agreement on the amendment. Get the notice to the seller saying, this is my notice of defects. Now, sometimes, however, a buyer who is concerned about the time frame of the inspection contingency, say it's happening tonight at midnight, may supply both the amendment and the notice at the same time of the buyer, including specific language. So if you are forced into sending them both at the same time, say you're right up against the clock for the expiration, you have to add this verbiage. The notice of defect is effective only if the seller does not accept the buyer's amendment dated blank or on or before blank. That sentence is very important if you're forced into sending both the amendment and the notice at the same time. But most people will send the amendment first. And then if that's not accepted by the deadline, the notice of defect is quickly sent over before the expiration date. Any questions on this? Good. You're also smart. Myth number 6. A notice should include the defects to be fixed and name the company to make the repairs. That's a myth. And the truth is the inspection contingency provides that the buyer may give written notice listing the defects identified in the report to which the buyer objects. It is not appropriate for the buyer to dictate how the seller will cure in a notice of defect. You just list the defects. The seller's obligations to cure are outlined on lines 216 to 226 in the offer to purchase. If the buyer wishes to negotiate method for repairing the defect, then an amendment is the appropriate tool before a notice is sent. Start your notice of defect, a properly written notice of defect. And I'm a stickler for this. You start out saying, this is a notice of defects. Following are the defects to which the buyer objects. And then you just list the defects. Don't list you don't copy and paste what the inspector said. You don't put down what the inspector said should be done. You just list the defects. And this is very common. This is a very common conversation that we have with our agents. Either our agents don't understand or our co-brokes don't understand, but it's very important. Yeah, I've heard several times where the co-brokers just copied and pasted the lines from the report. And of course, that will say what's wrong, what happens if it's not repaired, all sorts of things, what should be done. That does not belong in a notice of defect. And since it doesn't belong, it's not effective. Myth number 7, the home inspector determines what is or is not a defect. We had a change in the offer a little while ago, several years ago, where the home inspector actually had to list what he saw as defects. Now remember, most importantly, a home inspector's definition of a defect is all that we have as a definition of a defect in the, but it leaves out the issue of value, because the inspector can't assume value for a defect. So in our fully outlined definition of a defect, it has, it would affect the value of the property if not done. It would get worse if not taken care of, and all of that. But the inspector just has, it will get worse if it's not done. It leaves out the value issue definition. So with all of that, the truth is the offer to purchase defines the defect for an inspection contingency. And those are there on those lines. I can't read it. Whether any item listed is actually a defect is determined on a case-by-case basis. If the parties cannot agree whether an item is a defect as defined in the offer, then the parties should be directed to their respective attorneys for advice. A lot of times there's an argument that that's not a defect, and the buyer thinks it's a defect and the seller does not agree. That's when you have to go to attorneys and sometimes even into court to determine what a defect is. I've seen all kinds of creative defects that buyers have listed in their notice. One was there was crabgrass in the lawn.
Mm.
One was the siding had changed color on one side of the house. You have to look at the definition of a defect in the offer to purchase and see if it matches all 3 provisions. Not use the inspectors, but if the inspector has outlined something that's a defect, you can put that in. It's just that he won't be putting in the part of the definition that determines value on the property.
Mhm.
Is that clear?
I think this is our last slide.
That's our last one. So I think taking this angle of talking about inspection contingency, it gets to it the way we see it, the way the complaints come up or the confusing issues come up between our agent and, say, a co-broke. So it's nice to know these differences between myths and truths, and they're all documented in the offer line by line. So reread the offer if you have to send a copy of the offer's highlighted lines to the co-broke. Sometimes that works. Any general questions about the inspection contingency? Good. I want one last comment. I know we're back into a competitive market again and competitive offers. And a lot of times the buyers want to skip out of the inspection contingency and take the risk that maybe they're doing a full renovation on the property, or maybe they have the wherewithal to repair anything on the property that comes up. But there are a lot of things that could come up on a property that the seller may not know of, that you may not have seen in walking through the properties, that even the inspector did not see. So not having an inspection on a property is a huge risk. And it can be a very expensive risk for the buyer. So I would think twice, even though it gives more incentive to the seller to be able to skip the inspection. You have to realize that unless the buyer can cover anything that comes up, and a lot of things can come up, talking about structure, structure of the walls and the foundation, talking about attic structure, chimneys, roof. If you're leaving that just to your buyers and your observations, you may be missing a lot. So I'm just highlighting the idea that inspections are very important and have to be taken with a lot of risk. Plus the form that we have that says the buyer understands the risk and still does not want an inspection. But he has to sign that and send that with his offer. Any comments, Steph?
Not really. I think we covered it all.
Good. Yeah, so we're always available if you get stuck in a situation with the inspection contingency or any other part of the offer. But we wanted to really highlight what some of these myths are floating around. Good.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.